for someone to remember for Wally to see later on. Thanks again. I'm going to turn this over to Jack Miller, pastor in Bedford, who is going to welcome you and get us sent off with prayer.
Well, good morning and welcome to this reboot of the annual Synod, COM and CPM gathering. As Sue said, I'm Jack Miller. I'm the pastor of the Bedford Church in Huntington Presbytery, and I've been honored to be a part of a team working to put together this gathering that we hope will be meaningful for you during this season in which we find ourselves. This morning's workshop is called COVID-19. Pastoral Stress and Adaptation. And we are grateful to have the Reverend Dr. Wally Fletcher lead our presentation today. Wally has extensive training and experience as a therapist, consultant, educator, and nonprofit executive. He's a certified psychoanalyst and pastoral counselor. He teaches courses in organizational and strategic leadership at Newman University and serves on the emotional health faculty for the Board of Pensions Credo Clergy Wellness Program. He is a Presbyterian clergyman and serves as pastoral associate at the Presbyterian Church on the Mall in Plymouth Meeting, Pennsylvania. I'll reiterate what Sue said. I know many of us have insights to offer and questions to ask, and so we do ask that you please utilize the chat feature to submit your observations and questions at any time during the workshop, and try to keep your microphone muted as much as possible. As we begin, I invite you to pray with me. God, we know that we often hear your voice in the gentle whisper of the breeze. Right now, our lives seem filled with earthquakes, hurricanes, and 5-alarm blazes. Remind us that you are still in control. Guide our restless hearts, though they yearn to provide loving care to your children in this time, to find their rest in you, as you lead us into new ways of doing ministry in the name of Christ. Amen. Now let us give our attention to Wally as we welcome him this morning.
Invitation. Like you, this topic's something I've been thinking a lot about and hearing a lot about, and I'm like you in that I've been learning as I go as well. So I want to share three big parts of this. The first is to say a little bit about the types of stress that we are all dealing with these days and why that matters. And the second part, I want to share some results of a quick field research I did in preparation for this event, and then share some broad strategies for being supportive and helpful for clergy and congregations in this time. And I hope that much of the time we can spend after covering a little bit of this in questions and discussions. One of the things that I think about a lot with respect to stress is the importance of considering the complexities of stress and stress response and stress management, especially in this novel coronavirus context. There's a lot of wonderful and reliable advice out there about stress and stress management, but one of the things that I find important with the folks that I work with is to understand that stress is often complex, and that oversimplifying things too much in terms of general advice is sometimes not helpful. One of the most challenging parts of dealing with stress is identifying the specific sources along with the emotions and reactions that come with it. These different types of stress and stress responses require different strategies to manage them as well, which is why it's important to be able to kind of sort them out a bit. The task of sorting is made more difficult by a number of things. One is that our stress reactions are mostly automatic, and unconscious, at least in the beginning. We can't always identify easily the specific sources of what's stressing us out. And the same is true for the specific emotions and impulses that we're having along with it. It's not always easy to be able to say how we feel. So the question, how do you feel, may not be as simple a question as we might expect it to be when we ask it or hear it. And then stress finally often involves multiple sources and multiple emotional components that can be hard to sort out. So it can be hard to decide when you're in the midst of that kind of complex stress, where to start in terms of figuring out where to focus, and even being able to be clear about what's going to be helpful and what we need. So the idea is that one of the things that's important in dealing with stress is helping people develop reflective practices that help them to slow down and begin to sort out the different levels of the stress, and in the service of having more adaptive choices after that. And of course, as an analyst, I believe in the talking cure. I think one of the things that helps people sort through difficult experiences and affects and feelings and so on is being able to find people with whom they can put those things into words, and oftentimes in the hearing themselves talk and of being listened to well, they're able to sort things out that would be difficult for them to do otherwise. When I think about types of stress, I think about 5 main types. There probably are more, but that's enough. 3 of them are pretty familiar, and the last maybe less so, but are particularly relevant and important to take note of in this particular crisis. The stress that's most familiar to us, of course, is the kind that we often refer to as personal stress or primary stress. It's the kind, some of you still may remember the old Holmes Ray inventory that they used to circulate around, where you check off the things that have happened, like moving and separation and those kinds of things. And then you get a score on how high your stress level was. And I always warn people about that they should add 40 points for taking the test, because you will have, just taking the test will alone make you scared to death that you should have already died from all of your stress. All of you are familiar with primary stress. It's all the kinds of things that we all deal with every day. But in this context, there seems to be a whole lot more of them. Trying to do ministry work, and at the same time that you're also trying to learn how to be a kindergarten teacher or an elementary school teacher to a child, learning how to try Zoom for the first time or the 4th time or the 12th time, and hoping that what you learned the first time is going to continue to work for you. Whether or not to go to the grocery store can be a source of moral stress for people even these days. The second type of stress that we're very familiar with in ministry is referred to often as secondary stress. It's the kind of stress that helping professionals, pastors and counselors and nurses and doctors have as part of their job, when it's our job to help people be able to manage and contain their own stress. And in that process, we take in some of the burden of their stress and some of the burden of that processing. And so we can often, if we're not careful, be vulnerable to accumulating too much secondary stress, and that can turn into compassion fatigue and other things. Systemic stress is the kind of stress that results from working with or within highly demanding, anxious, strained, or unhealthy organizational or social cultural systems or environments. We're never entirely free of the context within which we are living, and the pressures that are exercised from us from wider systems that we're parts of. In this context, the kinds of things that come to mind, that are obvious are things like the systemic economic and social inequalities that have made a huge impact on disproportionately impacting some groups of people more than others. We're having a lot of many frustrations with systemic barriers to doing and getting things we need for ourselves, and which we'd like to be able to provide for others, like getting tested and those kinds of things. So systemic stress, particularly in a huge social crisis like this, is also a huge impingement on us. And we know that systemic stress has long-term impacts. I've spent a lot of time, as some of you have, with the study on the ACEs study, adverse childhood experiences, and what we've learned about the long-term impacts on people's physical health and so on. So we may be experiencing stress right now, and we also have to know that the stresses that people are going through now that are of a traumatic nature are likely to impact them for years and years to come if they're not tended to, and we're not aware of the importance of that. Moral stress is the kind of stress that results from dealing with situations that seriously test or threaten our core values, our sense of integrity, our sense of the kind of person, kind of pastor that we are. Moral stress happens when people find themselves or feel in no-win situations while they're trying and caring about trying to do the right thing. Dealing with hard choices that we're having to make these days about decisions about how to provide pastoral care in situations where we're sometimes asking ourselves not what's the right thing, but what's the less worse thing that we may be finding ourselves having to do. Moral stress is a topic that's getting a lot of attention in psychology these days, as we're beginning to understand that people who are moral and spiritual individuals really do suffer not neurotic anxiety and stress, but moral anxiety and stress when they find that they're in demoralizing situations that cause them to feel as if it's hard for them to do the kinds of things that they feel are right for them and for people that they care about. Overall, it's important to emphasize with all these forms of stress that they can take both acute and chronic forms. In the acute form, people are having the immediate stress reactions that we're all familiar with, that have the adrenaline flowing and our impulsivity and our fight-flight kinds of hormones raging through our body. In the ideal situation, we're able to be attended to and attend to those kinds of things in ways that bring relief. Chronic forms of any of these forms of stress are more problematic because part of what happens is people don't get enough relief. We live in a kind of constant state of arousal or vigilance around certain kinds of problems, and that can take a serious toll on us. It's important to take into account these varieties or different types of stress, because when you're trying to help people feel that they have a sense of efficacy about what they can do for themselves and how they can get help, the more they have clarity about the kind of stresses that they're under and the things that they can do more about and the things that they can do less about, and what's the best approach to dealing with stress at the particular levels that are hurting us and causing us distress the most. And then finally, there's the kicker that it's hardly ever the case once you've done that, what Robert Wicks, one of my colleagues, used to call a kind of personal stress debriefing at the end of every day, if you need to do it that day. I love that concept. that what we often find is that at any given time, we're not just dealing with any one of those levels or layers, we're dealing with some complexity of combination of those things. Then if that's not enough, the new kind of thing I'm adding to my stress handout that I use at Credo is a category that I'm calling adaptive stress. And that's by way of saying that all stress tests our adaptive capacities. That's what stress does. Stress, adaptation go together. But sometimes the speed and relentlessness with which adaptive change demands confront us can become a source of stress in its own right. In other words, when we're faced with a kind of onslaught of one after another kinds of things that require significant adaptation. I'm sure you're all familiar with Ronald Heifetz's work on adaptive work, adaptive change, adaptive challenges. And Heifetz understands adaptive challenge and adaptive work is the kind that's required when we find ourselves in new territory, where the things that we could rely upon for coping and for problem solving and so on no longer work, are no longer reliable in the same way. And where the kinds of things that are required of us to do really require new learning, new sorting out of values, changes in our values, and just finding new ways of doing things and being able to have an experimental mindset. It's time to brush up on your Heifetz if you haven't read him lately in terms of what adaptive leadership is. I said to Susan when we spoke about this earlier, just in a general way, that if ever there was a Heifetz moment, this is it in terms of what the adaptive demands upon us are doing to us. In the acute phase of that kind of feeling of being overwhelmed by too many things to adapt to at the same time, too many things to learn about at the same time, like the stuff that goes with technologies, we have the same kinds of reactions we have to every other kind of stress. There's the fight, flight, there's the sort of sense of scrambling for finding any way we can to kind of cope with the situation. And often we do self-defeating things because we go back, double down on the old solutions and waste a lot of adaptive energy trying to make those things work for us now when it's clear that that's not going to happen. In the chronic version, which is the kind I'm worried about a lot for myself as well as for the people and institutions that I work with, is when the impact of extraordinary adaptive challenges pile on and must be faced over long periods of times with little relief in sight. In other words, the more we hear about this crisis unfolding over time, the more it becomes clear that, the things that we were fussing over the first 2 weeks of trying to figure out how to have services, there'll be other stuff coming at us that we don't yet even imagine. So in preparation for this, there's a lot of literature, there's a lot of good things that people are writing about all of this. But when I'm thinking about something like this, I always like to begin by turning to the experts who really teach me the most. And in this case, they were also people that I knew I could trust to respond in a short period of time that we had to prepare for this. I contacted people who, most of whom are in 3 ongoing clergy groups that I lead, as well as a select group of other folks that I know and trust well. These are folks who are pretty reflective folks, or they wouldn't be doing the work they're doing for themselves and self-care. And there are people who are willing to respond in a short time to these questions. And I kept it simple, and I asked three questions, and I want to share the responses with you. The first question was, what are you finding most stressful in ways you tend to experience as distressing? The second question was, since not all stress necessarily leads to distress, what are you finding stressful in ways you tend to experience as energizing and or positive in some other way? And then the third question is, what resources are you finding most helpful for meeting the stressful challenges that you've described? I was happy that people were willing to respond and be so willing to share these things on short notice. And I was also moved by the responses from people. And so what I tried to do for this, for this piece of our presentation is I've combined all of their responses to all the questions into one document. I've selected out some specific quotes that without any identifiers on them, and then organized them in some big themes that recur and that may be helpful in reflecting on how to be helpful with these things. So that's how we went about it. The people who responded were about 16. That's a high number for such a short period of time and a big request. 9 of them were men, 7 of them were women, 10 of them were in pastoral situations in either small to mid-sized churches. 3 of them were in pastoral situations in corporate-sized congregations. 4 of them were in other forms of ministry, because I wanted to pay attention to those folks who we may not think of as often as we should. 1 of them was a part-time Episcopal deacon who's working in a large parish, but his full-time job is as an ICU nurse, and he is now isolated so that he can do his work. And I was very moved that he took the time to respond. The other person in that category is a full-time parish nurse in a large corporate-sized congregation and a member of a credo faculty. Another person is a full-time hospice chaplain and part-time pastor in a small UCC church. And the fourth is a retired church administrator. I think church administrators have a lot to teach us and that we should listen to them. They observe us in our work as well as do their own ministry, and she's an administrator in the Credo program. 10 of the folks were PCUSA folks. 4 of them were Episcopalian, 1 of them was a Lutheran, and 1 of them UCC. So here are the themes, and there's so much wonderful material and I can't honor it all, but I'll try to hit some of the high points. So the first question was, what do you find most stressful in ways that you tend to experience as distressing? The category that I described as the theme here, there were 7 themes in that category. And the first one I called adapting to social distancing and the ambiguous role of technology in this process, especially in sensitivities of uncertain duration and where pastoral presence and sensitivity is needed and expected the most. Social distancing and the ambiguous role of technology in the process. Ambiguous means it's something that you can love and hate at the same time. You can recognize, thank God we have it, and oh my God, how are we going to be able to make the best use of it? How are we going to make sure it works, and so on? So just here are a few fragments of quotes. Someone wrote, technology helps in maintaining basic connections with some folks, but it's a poor substitute in some important situations. For example, I couldn't visit a beloved member as she was dying. I tried praying with her over the phone, but I'm not sure she could hear me, and I certainly couldn't hear her. I felt like I couldn't fully be her pastor at the end of her life, and that grieves me. I also miss being able to scan the congregation for who might be in trouble. Any of you recognize those kinds of things? Someone wrote, only being able to connect through technology has made this present crisis distressing. Add it to my retirement at the end of the month, and distress is the order of the day. This is a pastor who served, and I have 4 people actually in that category that I know well, work with, who are retiring in the midst of this process. And the whole amount of energy and their congregations have put into trying to say goodbye in all the ways we like to be able to say goodbye have now evaporated into the ether, and they will and are trying to find other ways to do that, and experiencing it as painful. Someone wrote, needing to move all our worship events online made me feel like I was in a tech job with zero training or experience, and I had no time to figure it out. What should take me an hour is taking me 3. The worship blunders, and then that person continues with a great number of examples about what that's been like and the energy that it's taking. And someone kind of summed up by saying every aspect of the ministry must be retooled. This is like getting a whole new job or career. Some clergy are over-functioning and holding themselves to impossible standards. Some clergy are completely overwhelmed by the technology issues. So that's the first thing. The second thing, not surprisingly, is I've labeled dealing with existential fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. Someone wrote just simply this sentence in quotes, the fear, who in my close circle of loved ones might become sick. Someone else wrote, moral stress over making high stakes decisions over what's essential and to whom, and assessing levels of risk. This is especially intense when there's a lot that is still unknown about and many mixed messages. And when many of the people I work with are fragile, both in terms of their health and economically, as is the congregation as a whole where she serves. Several people commented of concern and firsthand experiences of the heightened vulnerability of ministers who are also in frontline roles in healthcare settings like chaplains and vocational folks like nurses. One deacon wrote, a lot of my experience of stress is also related to my very distressing experience of being an RN at this time and the moral injury we are collectively experiencing in that profession. So the third big theme was I've labeled dealing with complex grief. One of the first of many articles that came my way in the first few weeks was an article that was published in the Harvard Business Review. It was given to me about, and the article was entitled, great title, That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief. And the person who gave it to me was a client who is trying to grieve at the same time his fairly recent retirement, the death of his mother some months ago, and the recent death of his wife, along with the griefs that have come with having to figure out all the things that you do to relieve yourself of grief. Many of the things that he thought he might be able to do, he's somewhat confined from doing. So complex grief is the kind of grief that people and systems have when they have a lot of different, people have their own grief present and of all kinds to deal with, as well as the anticipatory grief of what might be coming next or what kinds of losses might yet be coming our way. grief for others, the kind of the grief that is that goes with seeing other people in grief and wanting to be able to comfort them. And the thing that I most frequently say about grief to folks that I care about is you have to say that grief is painful, exhausting, and always takes more time than we think it should. Freud was the first person who invented the term grief work, and grief really is work. It takes a lot of energy, and when people are processing grief as part of their experience, it takes a lot of energy, and people really can be exhausted about it. Congregations experience grief, and oftentimes grief is handled by congregations in ways that are not adaptive and lead to more resistance. One of the most important things that I heard Heifetz say that I remind myself and other leaders of regularly is when he said that we're always talking about people resisting change when they need to be adaptive. And he said, it's important to remember that people don't resist change, they resist loss. So until people are able to acknowledge grief and loss and process that loss and grief in a healthy way, it's going to be very hard for them to make the adaptive changes that they and we would like them to be able to make. I'm going to speed up here now so we can get to questions. The fourth of these themes under distress was concerns about financial insecurity, both the personal at the level of clergy and ministers and their congregations. This is not one that's surprising to us because many congregations have been under a lot of financial pressure for a long time, but certainly this has increased that anxiety. The fifth common theme in terms of the comments was the feeling of a lack of access to many normal leisure and self-care activities that people rely on in order to keep themselves in good condition emotionally and spiritually. And someone said that they felt that they had difficulty unplugging when normal signs of time quit and aren't there. People lose a sense of time. The lack of physical contact that people can experience and social distancing and feelings of isolation. People who are living singly are sometimes especially challenged by this. The sixth theme under the distress side of this is I've called it dealing with complex stress and its longer term impact. Obviously, in this situation, many people are scrambling and struggling with several sources of stress at the same time, which makes it even harder to sort out and figuring out the best ways to cope. One of the common examples that showed up in the remarks were people who talked about who have children in school and who are trying to figure out how to do their job and do it well without too much moral stress that they're not doing enough, while also worried about making sure they're doing enough for their kids and providing them with what they need and deserve. In that category, I noticed that a number of people referred to not being productive. We're Presbyterians, most of these folks were, we really care about productivity a lot. And so there was a fair amount among some people of expressions of moral stress about, whether I'm doing enough and being productive enough. And one of the things that doesn't take into account is what I said earlier about how exhausting it is to adapt to stress. People are tired for a very good reason, even if they feel like they're not doing as much as they ordinarily would be able to do. And then finally, though a number of people wrote some really helpful to me and interesting things that I called finding and articulating a meaningful versus apologetic framework for understanding and processing all of this. In other words, this is where our theological perspective and our biblical are concerned about how do we help people find a narrative that's larger than this moment and larger than our own personal experience that can provide a different kind of context for us. And so as I read some of the remarks, I of course often go to Brueggemann, who talks about how the prophets exercise prophetic imagination in helping people put their grief into a different kind of framework and learn how to hold the tension between grief and hope and prophetic criticism and prophetic energizing, he called it, without dipping into what Jeremiah warned us about when he says, they have healed the wounds of my people lightly, crying peace, peace when there is no peace. So some of the clergy that I've been talking with have talked about how important their lectio groups have been to them, how important it has been to them to be able to have support, to think and encouragement to think in new ways about how to articulate these things in the language of faith. So those are the 7 themes that emerged out of that first question about distress. I'm glad I asked the second question because about the idea that stress, not all stress necessarily becomes distressing, because the other side, oftentimes the same things that stress us out can have another side of the coin. And sometimes that other side of the coin can be even energizing or positive in certain ways. So there were basically 2 big themes that emerged out of the comments that I heard here. One of them was discovering untapped adaptive capacities within ourselves and our congregations. And I'll read a couple of quotes. Some churches and pastors are surprising themselves with creative and very quick adaptation to technology, and that they and their congregation were frightened or dismissive of. Someone said, rising to the challenge of learning new ways to minister. Somebody also said, much of what I described above made me feel energized and excited. In those early days, I kept thinking about the opportunities that the pandemic has brought to the church. We had to think in new and creative ways. The enormity of the event also drew our staff and lay leadership together. Someone else said, it's stressful but satisfying to figure out new ways of doing things. Many of my new skills and strategies are based on technology, but I've also made small changes in the way I've arranged some of the furniture in my apartment and tried out some new recipes. So once you open up and get into experimental mindset, people often find that they can cross over into other domains of their lives with those kinds of new skills. The second theme here that came out strongly and impressively to me, and sometimes eloquently, was the sense of participating in a moment of extraordinary historical and social spiritual significance. Someone said, the stress that has been energizing has been around preaching. I've always loved preaching, and there have been Holy Week and Easter seasons when I've really struggled to find anything new to say about the gospel stories. With this new context, there's so much to say, so many ways to interpret the text. There's been a lot of pressure to be prophetic and comforting right now, and I feel like I've been able to do that in my sermons. I'm finding I have a lot to say in this strange time, and I'm encouraged that our scripture have a lot to say as well. A number of churches spoke about an uptick in their attendance. More people are, and I've heard this across the board from people, more people are on church now, since they can access it online. At least 3 different folks whom I've talked to in the last week have referred to the possibility that there could be another Great Awakening. This crisis, as difficult as it is, has a lot of folks have risen to the occasion and are finding in it new sources of reflection and new sources of hope for thinking about a future that is better than the one that we have now. And then the final question was, what resources are you finding most helpful and important for meeting the stress challenges that they've already described? And not surprisingly, the things that wasn't surprising me, I don't think it will be to you, that the word for that theme is connections. All we know, all the research that we have about human resilience is that by far the most important thing in human resilience are the connections that people have with one another, with themselves, with God, with their congregations. And so there are too many quotations for me to go through, but people are referring to colleagues, other clergy support groups, Facebook groups, families. I hope that there are a couple of Presbyterian execs here, because from more than one source I heard people talk about how helpful it has been and how good it has felt to them to have contact from Presbyterian execs and bishops who make them feel cared about and provide resources and so on. So connections was one big theme. The second big theme people reflected on and told stories about was self-care. And everybody has what works for them, but people talked about exercise, meditation, eating healthier, taking breath, prayer, reflection, and those kinds of things. So people became reflective about their self-care practices. And then finally, the other thing that was a theme here was sharing resources. People listed articles, YouTube videos. I've been impressed with how many articles and resources have come across my desk in the last few weeks as they have with you. I like getting them, but what I also figured out was people like sharing them. It makes people feel good to be able to share articles or thoughts and so on that were helpful to them and might be helpful to other people. So that's the results of, I summarized it pretty quickly, but I hope you got the feel. That's the results of my little field study in terms of people's responses to those questions. I'd like to get to yours, so maybe I'll just list very quickly the suggestions that arose in my mind around these things from the perspective that COMs and CPMs may be looking at. They're not surprising, and they're things that you're, I'm sure, already thinking about and already doing. But I think what I heard from these folks reinforced the importance of these things and might suggest some others. The first one on my list is ask about stress. Listen for complexity in that stress and from the multiple levels, and listen for the coping strategies that people describe. Without making stress sound like a disease, help people feel comfortable talking about and acknowledging their stress. The second thing that I would be thinking about, and I'm always thinking about, is how can we encourage and facilitate vital connections? The people that were in this group were people who are already very good at that. They're connected people, and they know how to connect. Not everybody, sadly, is in that situation, and they need encouragement and sometimes resources to seek out things like clergy groups, all kinds of possibilities that are available to people for developing connections. I'm a fan of Parker Palmer's and his emphasis on the importance for human beings, particularly those doing the kind of work we're doing, of having, being part of circles of trust, he calls them. And his definition, I heard him say this definition in a conference I was with him at Trinity, Wall Street, about a month or two after 9/11. And so this quote stuck with me, and I wrote it down as I heard him say it. And he described circles of trust as the creation of bounded, safe, and trustworthy communal spaces where the soul is welcomed and invited to show up, to speak its truth, and to make its claim on the living of our lives. So I'd be thinking about how can we, as presbyteries and synods, continue to be creative in ways of helping people be connected. Along those lines, is encouraging and resourcing people to get the qualified help that they need, especially in dealing with complex stress. Encouraging people to check in with the Board of Pensions, and the Board of Pensions has been doing a lot lately about trying to connect and communicate with people what they're doing. But there are ways for people to get telemedicine. There's ways for people to get teletherapy, coaches, lots of resources, and more we can help people feel encouraged about those things, the better. I thought also of, while we're doing this, is considering the stress impact and coping styles, not only of clergy ministers, but of lay leaders and congregations. I worry a lot about these people. Many times they're volunteers, obviously. They're often highly devoted and essential. Sometimes they're overfunctioners, and they can be vulnerable to the same kinds of stresses that clergy are. And paying attention as we're working with them in non-judgmental ways to the stress impact and coping styles of congregations. Many congregations were stressed and feeling fragile before this crisis arose. Some of them, and what happens with them now could turn out to be decisive for them. Some of them will rise to the occasion, excuse me, and surprise themselves and other people. And part of our challenge there will be, how do we help them sustain instead of regressing during the crisis. And then finally, helping leaders like us help the church and the world exercise foresight with the moral, spiritual, and adaptive intelligence we need for dealing with these complex stress demands in a fast and through the fast and slow phases of this crisis. This is one of the ones that scares me the most, is that this is a crisis that's going to go through phases, and we're going to have the experience over a period of time of fast and slow, of things coming at us fast, surprisingly, and yet slowly unfolding over a long period of time. So I think we're already starting to anticipate what the summer is going to be like, what's going to happen in the fall when it's supposed to be time to go back to classrooms and so on. What about that second wave in November? And then whenever the new normal conversations begin to happen, it's not likely that we're talking about 21 or 22. So I have a little sore throat here, and it's time to stop. Anyway, those are some ideas that I wanted to put out there, and I think we got about 20 minutes for questions and answers.
Well, we have a few things in the chat. If we can maybe wrestle with those first.
Right.
One of them is points to some very specific stressors in ministry. Even at this time, can you imagine that there might be different expectations and understandings between pastor and congregation? And so the specific stress mentioned relates to a pastor who in his own house, his own family, for them, it is a social distancing concern to go to the sanctuary to provide worship. They would rather provide it from home, if I understand correctly. And yet the congregation would like for that to be provided with the couple people necessary from the church, and the understanding of, you know, social distancing and what is risky and whatever. And that's stressful. Any thoughts around that kind of situation? Because I'm sure it's not the only type that we see.
No, expectations are at the center of most conflicts.
Really?
Interpersonal, relational, and so on. And people clearly are divided, not just in churches, but other places, about what's an acceptable level of risk and how to manage risk and so on. And it would be surprising to me if it wasn't the case that there would be these occasions where certain people, and within congregations, there's going to be different expectations and so on. So I think the most important thing we can do, to the extent that there's a healthy enough relationship, that this is a test of collaboration. Ministers can't decide this. Lay people can't decide this. These are things that people have to pretend like they're the body of Christ and actually come together and have conversations. And it has to start with the executive leadership of congregations. The session in our church, the session and the pastor first have to have that conversation, acknowledging that there are going to be differences of expectations, and we have to find a way to deal with not everybody being happy and not everybody being satisfied. But you know, it's very difficult. I don't have any easy answers for that, other than it's part of that adaptive work. Adaptive work has to be collaborative. People, one of the adaptive challenges that we're facing everywhere is the realization that the problems that we are dealing with today are problems that cannot be dealt with singly by super pastors, super leaders, CEOs, by any one group of people. People are going to have to find some way to work together. And that's in itself an adaptive challenge in many congregations. And it's a different style of leadership than people expect.
Wally, if I may, I want to add something from my own experience in listening around this region, and I know it's not just this region, is that some pastors are more comfortable in the virtual environment than others, not just pushing the buttons, but being present to the congregation. Some are more comfortable than others. Some have history, you know, blah, 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 and people are trying it. I think we have to be careful not to underestimate how folks out there are experiencing that presence and experiencing the time that may or may not be togetherness for them. It's surprising to hear that as our folks are grappling, what may seem to us like not togetherness is for them holding on with a tight grip to what they can, to what they know and what they remember. It takes conversation. You talk about collaboration. In my estimation, to understand what they are receiving and what they are not, to help us tweak who we are and who we aren't. But perfection is not the goal. Technical perfection, presentation perfection, it is first the presence to do that.
Absolutely. And one of the things, so I'm not only relating to religious organizations. I'm chair of a board of an institute that has a clinic, and so all of our therapists are had to switch. We work mostly with low-income clients, and our clients and therapists all had to switch to online telesessions. We can't go in that building, and I don't know when we'll get to go in that building again at times soon. And one of the things that was surprising and I had to do it with all of my work in a very short time. And at first I was surprised by how little resistance I encountered. I wouldn't have been surprised by resistance. I was surprised by how little resistance and how cooperative people have been, even as they're not, it's not their first choice of how they want things. And then it dawned on me that I shouldn't have been surprised at all, because what was clear to me is that people need connection. They need the connection, and they want to connection, and more people than not will even be willing to tolerate some of these difficult disappointments in the service of just having church, or having therapy, or having coffee hour. Some churches are doing coffee hour on the phone, very creative kinds of things. Yep. This is a time when people need contact, and and that's why I think these attendance numbers have not gone down as everybody feared they might, but they've actually gone up. People need each other more than ever.
Thank you. Here's another one about physical presence. For who is the loss of physical presence most crucial? Is it the pastor's need or the other person's?
Yeah. Well, I think it's both. I think it is a real loss. I don't think we should minimize it at all. We are we have bodies. We're physical creatures. From the very time of our inception, we're embodied some way, and we're embodied with other people and related to other people in profoundly important ways through physical presence and physical touch and so on. And the absence of availability of those opportunities to, some people feel it differently and more acutely than other people. We're all differently wired about a lot of these different things, but it's certainly important to acknowledge that there's a grief there when people don't have that kind of presence available to them, while at the same time acknowledging that is imperfect as telephones and screens and so on are, they're still contact and there's still connection, and they're certainly better than people being isolated without connections at all. So it's challenging.
Here's a take on that. One person went on to say, I've heard those who are huggers are really struggling with isolation. How important is physical touch in this, and how can we substitute for it? Now, I kiddingly reposted to Dot and said, the Forestry Service was talking about going out and hugging a tree yesterday, and I don't think it's all a joke. But what have you experienced? What do you think about that? That we saw the grandparents who put on plastic garbage bags and went to see their grandchildren just to get a hug.
It speaks for itself. I mean, it's important. People, people need they need touch, they need hugs, they need connections at that level. Hugging trees is fine. We have a grandson who's, he turned 3 in April, and he's very good at making you feel hugged on the phone. I say he bounces around, and his exuberance is physical, because everything he does is physical. And so again, acknowledging the loss and grief, the feeling of disconnection, the loneliness that people can feel, and caring about people who are particularly challenged in that ways is something that we owe everyone, including ourselves, while at the same time encouraging them to stay connected in whatever way is possible, and try to be yourselves. I mean, these technologies, one of the challenges is it feels more artificial the more artificial we are. And the more we try to, I'm glad you said, not to worry about the production values and, these kinds of things that we're doing, because those things can actually get in the way. We don't want to produce perfectly produced exchanges between people, as human as we can make them, and as human as we can be, and as human as we can let other people be. We need to do as much as we can of that right now.
I'm going to skip to Maureen Wright's question, and then David, back up to yours, which is real specific situations that I know many of us are going to be dealing with. Maureen's is more global. Maureen is asking from West Virginia, is there a connection between this discomfort and emotional intelligence, or is it something else?
Yes, it's related. And so emotional intelligence, Goleman says, he talks about self-awareness, awareness of our own feelings and affects and their impact on others. He talks about emotional self-regulation. He talks about being able to kind of sustain and persevere over time. He talks about empathy, which is really the most important thing, and social skills. I think those are the 5 categories he's talking about. Basically, the idea is, our emotional intelligence is as or more important than our IQ, if you will, particularly in situations like this. And so attending to our emotional intelligence and the ways in which all of us have strengths and weaknesses there, like everything else, and what do we need to, and thinking about what do we need to work on most. But the 2 most important from my perspective are self-awareness and empathy. Those are the 2 things that are most critical for leaders, I think, to be successful in helping people through difficult times. And emotional self-regulation is the idea that we humans have to learn from birth this really difficult thing of learning how to have all of our feelings without letting our feelings have us. Now, that's fancy business. And so this idea of, in a time when we are stressed and we're and experiencing stress that activates our very primitive, if you will, emotional reaction equipment, which is basically oriented around fight, flight, or lay down and be still, withdraw. Those are going to be impulses that are going to shape our emotional reactions and make us subject. Dan Goleman, I like Goleman's metaphor of emotional hijackings. When our initial fight, flight, our emotions and so on take over, and we're not able to use the front part of our brains enough to really mediate our responses in the right way or help us manage those feelings. So that's a big challenge, and we have to be, on the one hand, attentive to that. Also, I think we have to be able to cut people a little, ourselves and other people a little, cut slack about it as well, recognizing that it's a hard thing to do. And, people might need to be forgiven from time to time about how they react in a stressful situation of stress.
So here is a question that it really was posted as a share, but I want to frame it. And I'm going to ask you to put on, whether you like it or not, a COM hat alongside of your counseling hat. Many of us are in situations where there are folks in process of retiring as it happened, moving, and they're moving to new calls, and they're not necessarily scenarios that can be put off. We have figured out in some ways what to do with death and dying. We're putting that off. It's like being in the Adirondacks, and you can't bury until, you can't do the whole thing until the summer comes. We're putting that off. But when we have folks retiring and maybe have retired in these last few weeks, when we have folks moving and have to move, or the call needed to change because maybe there was some tension there and it ended, but there were not the goodbyes and celebrations. What do you think about that? Do we do what we can online? Is there wisdom in thinking about a future time and the face-to-face happening?
Thank you for asking that. I have right now, I think I mentioned, I have 3 or 4 in that category of either being recently retired or 2 people who are right now going to have to have their first son, or their last sermon is going to be, the way we're all doing it, live streaming right now. On the other end, I have 3 folks that I work with who actually, one of them is newly ordained. So not only is that person taking on a new call, they're doing it in the context of having to, figure out how to do these things and how do you form relationships. So we know about beginnings, that beginnings matter, and that the most important thing for people in the beginning of any kind of pastoral relationship has to do with bonding. It has to do with trust building. It has to do with all these kind of close-up things that we're missing now. And instead, all of that's going to be mediated through technology. The same with saying goodbye. So saying hello and saying goodbye are 2 of the most complicated emotional processes that human beings engage in. I think in terms of COMs, in one of these cases, the retiree expressed real appreciation for the willingness of the presbytery exec and COM to exercise some flexibility when he and the congregation, he'd been there for a long time. It was a very healthy situation. He was a great leader, and they were greatly appreciative of him. And so they had to postpone his face-to-face retirement party, or whatever you want to call it. And someone said, well, can he come back later? He wants and say goodbye that way. And this person said, of course. Now, we know all the things about how important it is to be careful about boundaries and so on, but it's also important to be adaptive in ways that recognize that, we may again think collaboratively. I think it's going to be, I would be careful about trying to set policy. I think these are times when, again, people need to talk and collaborate and try to imagine, how do we honor the things that are most important to honor and respect. I wouldn't want to try to be more specific than that, because I think that puts you in a danger zone of hemming us in instead of helping us learn how to figure it out.
Well, the AMCL, some of you are on that group, which is the mid-council leaders across the denomination. Some of the most active conversations in the last few days have been about baptisms. Baptism. Nobody's gotten to marriage yet, but baptisms and funerals and installations. And we have some folks who really do need to be ordained. And whether we do something online and then go back to a bigger, it's all part of that continuing some moving while we can, rather than standing static when we don't have to. And our book of order is being challenged anew.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it will be, but partly because we don't. I mean, it would be easier if we could say, of course you can come back in 2 months, you know, and we can do it, and we can clean all this stuff up. But everything that I think we are learning about this is that one of the adaptive challenges is what I've tried to call this fast, slow, phasic dimension, where we do live in a period of uncertainty about how long we will have to continue to social distance it in ways that have this kind of impact. It's going to be a while, and I think it is going to continue to test our values and our, one of the guys that I read about, I can't remember which one it was, but one of the guys that I like reading about leadership said, and I've been thinking about just this one phrase of his a lot recently, is he says, you know, leadership is about articulating the essentials. So we have to think about what is let me put it, he says, of the essence. I like that better. So we have to think about what is the essence? What is the spirit of the law? What is the essence of what we as Presbyterians mean by being a connectional church, being a body of Christ, being in exile, coming home. Our scriptures have many amazing resources for framing things in ways that might be of use to our book of order.
Thank you. Wally, we're about time, and I think that we need to go ahead and have you make maybe a few last words and pray us out, because folks need lunch break. There's some other things going on. This has been really wonderful. If you wanted to look at the bottom of your screen where it says reactions, you have the ability to give a thumbs up or a clap on your screen. Across the bottom of your screen, this is a new thing in Zoom. You can see it on mine. Reactions, there you go. But Wally, if you would, some of these things you referred to, if you would get to me, maybe some articles and some things that we can send out. We're going to send out the evaluations momentarily, and Wally's name's at the top of that list. Yours are all hidden. But we will call through the chat and get some stuff back to you next week at some point. Thank you so much. This is one of the most important topics, I think, for us as leaders. We have to continue to dialogue with this topic as we go through this. So peace be with you, brother, and please send us out as you will.
Okay. Gracious and loving God, you knew us before we were not only conceived in the womb, but before we were conceived in creation, and you've been with us and called us time and time again to grow and deepen in our understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to be faithful and loving and Christian. And we ask that in this time in which our imaginations are stretched and around all of those things, that you will continue to illuminate us and be our vision and help us be a vision and be other people's vision and informed by other people's vision as we learn how to be in these times. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
And thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Pleasure.